This video is just a sample of what's available in the free DPE University Learning Centre. Head over to DPE University to take the full course, earn a certificate, and unlock your potential with Develocity. You can find links in the description below. Now, let's explore seeing the details of your build in navigating a build scan.
In the first chapter of this training unit, you saw the overview of the build scan. You saw the build scan contains quite a lot of information, and this information is different, potentially for different people doing different things, or for the same person wanting to understand different facets of the build scan. In this chapter, we're going to concentrate on what a developer wants to see about a build they just ran. So in this chapter, we're going to cover the sections of the build scan which are most appropriate for you when you're trying to figure out what happened with your build. We will cover which sections of a build scan show the inputs and outputs of the build, where do you go to find the console output, how can you see build or test failures, and where do you see the details of the environment that the build ran in. The best way to demonstrate this is with a live demonstration. This is a build scan that ran on the Spring project, which is a hosted Develocity instance for all of the Spring projects. We can see this build failed. We're going to use this to take a look at the most relevant areas of the build scan to help us troubleshoot this problem. The summary screen shows us a whole bunch of useful information, and anything which is failing is showing up on red, so we can use that to jump straight away to any problems. What I really want to do is show the areas on the left-hand side which help us to drill down into that. For example, we can click through and see the console log. This shows us the output of running the build. This may be helpful if we want to see something like the familiar console output, and we can see what ran and exactly where the problems are. This might help us navigate directly to a class. For example, we might want to copy this and then use that to open that class in our IDE. We can also jump directly to the failures. This lets us see the exceptions, which we can expand, and we can see the stack trace. In this case, we can actually see the exception as a failing test, so we probably don't care that much about the specific stack traces. We can see there are two. It says failure 1 of 2, 2 of 2. If we wish, we can jump directly to this in the console. Once again, this gives us perhaps a more familiar view of the error. Now, at this point, we're probably less interested in any deprecations, less interested in the performance. We want to jump directly to the test failures, as we've seen there's a problem with the tests. In this area, we can see the tests that were run, whether they passed, and we can also see straight away there are 2 failures. We can click on this to show just the failed tests. This expands out the search and filter criteria. If we hadn't clicked on that, we can open up the search criteria by clicking on this magnifying glass here. This lets us navigate directly to the tests which are interesting to us. We can look for a specific task path. For example, in this case, the tests are split up by core, by data, by docs, etc. So we can filter by those. We can get rid of a filter by clicking on the cross. We can look for a specific test class, which will show us all the tests that ran in that class. We can look for a specific test case. This will list all of them. In this case, it only lists the top 100. Maybe we might want to say, let's look for everything which is a Mongo test. And then it will show us all tests which are testing MongoDB connections. Or we can filter by outcome. We'll talk about flaky tests in another training session. What we're interested in here is the failed tests. These are our 2 failed tests. These are failing integration tests. When I click on one of these, it will show me what failed, and I can even see the expected results, and the output from this particular test gives hints as to what might be wrong. If this build scan is in an instance of Develocity rather than the free build scans, I can actually take a look at the test history. This might be really helpful for seeing the patterns in passing and failing of this test. And so we can see that this test has actually failed a few times. We're not going to cover this here because this will be covered in a later training. But it is important to understand that we don't have to see the results just in isolation. We can see trends and patterns in our builds and in the tests that are run. The next area that might be relevant, we might be interested in seeing which projects were built as part of this build, and we can see that it's these 2 projects that failed. We may be interested in the dependencies which are pulled in, since it might be a dependency that caused some of the problems. However, in this case, it's not so relevant. We will look at the Dependencies tab in a little bit more detail in a later chapter. Then finally, the last thing which might be important to us in diagnosing what went wrong with this build is in the command that was run, the variables which was set, and the environment the build ran in. So for example, the custom values here, in this case, it shows us which Git branch it was and which commit it was. That's helpful if we want to reproduce the problem. Then it makes sense that we want to get exactly the same commit that was run. The switches tell us important and useful information like, was the build cache enabled? Is it running in parallel? Is it using the daemon? And so forth. So these switches enable us to potentially reproduce this problem locally, or at least have visibility over which settings were enabled where the build was running. And then finally, the infrastructure shows us things like the operating system that was used, the number of CPU cores available, the Java runtime, and so forth. So as a developer, when you're trying to figure out what went wrong with a specific build, these are the kinds of areas that you're probably most interested in. The summary, which gives us an overview of exactly what happened with the build. The console log to give us detailed output from the build. The failure summaries, which helps narrow in on exactly what failed. In this particular case, the tests are quite helpful too, because the failure actually happens to be a test failure. Projects may be helpful to understand which projects were impacted by the failure. The custom values, the switches, and the infrastructure tabs are all important to understand the circumstances under which this build ran. These are your key areas for troubleshooting problems with specific builds.
Thank you so much for watching this lesson on seeing the details of your build in navigating a build scan. Again, the entire course is available for free on DPE University at dpeuniversity.gradle.com. Click on the DPEU icon to get started and subscribe to learn more. We're excited to see what you build and test.